Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Leika Knafman, and I'm a senior agriculture specialist with the National Wildlife Federation. Joining me today are Kim Ernst-Pitcher with Prairie Rivers Network, our Illinois affiliate, and Emily May with the Xerces Society. So today we'll go over some current issues with the herbicide dicamba, and including some current status of the dicamba herbicide registrations and ongoing lawsuits, and the extent of impacts to plants and wildlife that depend on them, and an introduction to recognizing and reporting symptoms of herbicide injury to trees, crops, and ornamental plants. But before we get started, I did want to cover a few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly, though it won't really have any video feeds since everyone here is in listen-only mode, barring the panelists. So you will just be seeing our presentation and our little thumbnail video. You will notice a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens where you can enter your questions. So please enter them as we go along, so we can make sure to get to them at the end of the webinar. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So many of you will have already seen this, but last fall we released a report on the impacts of the herbicide dicamba to wildlife and habitat. And today we will cover a little bit of the information from that report, but you can find the entire report at NWF's website at www.nwf.org/drifting toward disaster. There's a lot of information in there that we can't feasibly get to today. But today we will be covering a brief history of dicamba and what's going on now, and then what this means for wildlife and how to recognize symptoms from injury and how to monitor and report those, including what's next on the horizon. So, dicamba is an herbicide that was first introduced in the 1960s and was widely used for, and has been widely used for, broadleaf weed control in crops, lawns, and turf grass. Dicamba and a similar herbicide, 2,4-D, are synthetic auxins, which are basically growth regulator herbicides that mimic plant hormones and disrupt growth in broadleaf plants. In crops, these herbicides have historically been used at the beginning of the growing season as a pre-emergent to burn down, i.e. to prepare fields for planting by burning down annual broadleaf weeds. But dicamba and 2,4-D are volatile compounds that have a relatively high vapor pressure, which means that they are more likely than other herbicides to evaporate and move away from the site they were applied as vapor drift. And they can continue volatilizing off of plant surfaces and even soil for several days after application. And once it's in the atmosphere, it can move a half mile or more before falling out on other areas. So this has been a known issue with dicamba since its introduction, and has generally limited the allowable uses and popularity of dicamba in or near broadleaf crops until very recently. So what brought dicamba into much more widespread use? It started a couple decades ago. So in the 90s, there were certain crops genetically engineered to withstand the herbicide glyphosate. That was in itself introduced back in the 70s and was highly effective in controlling weeds, perennial weeds. These herbicide-resistant crops really changed the face of row crop agriculture. Herbicide-based weed management was simple and cost-effective, So by 2015, glyphosate-resistant corn, cotton, and soybean varieties were planted on 85% or more of their respective crop acreages. But this near universal adoption of glyphosate-resistant crop technology for weed control led to the development of substantial weed resistance to glyphosate. So glyphosate-resistant weed species have emerged in at least 120 million acres of row crop fields, especially in the Midwest and the Mid-South of this country. So the simple, cost-effective system was breaking down, and it fueled demand for a new herbicide, new options to combat resistant weeds in crop fields. So enter dicamba again. So because developing new herbicides is a long and difficult process, companies decided to turn to older herbicides as replacements for or in addition to glyphosate resistance in crops. Since 2015, several companies have released proprietary soybean and cotton seeds resistant to dicamba or 2,4-D and generally dually resistant to glyphosate as well. So in addition to the new resistant crops, companies also released new formulations of dicamba or 2,4-D herbicides intended for in-crop use with these seeds. But we've known for years that those older products had problems staying put, and that if they were used later in the season when temperatures are higher, which is when dicamba would be used for post-emergent weed control, in dicamba resistant crops, that movement and plant injury from vapor drift would be quite likely. So 3 new herbicide formulations labeled for in-crop use were conditionally registered in late 2016 and released in time for the 2017 growing season. These were widely marketed as having solved dicamba's problems with volatility and vapor drift. They were granted conditional registration by the EPA for 2 years, starting in 2016 and then in 2018, and most recently in 2020 for an additional 5 years. So this graph, these two figures are just to really show you the spike in widespread dicamba use between the years 2016 and 2017, which is the latest this data set is available for. And they show use of dicamba by year and crop. So if you look at the graph on the right, it shows the estimated use of dicamba in millions of pounds by year and crop. And you see this kind of steady decline for 10 to 15 years following the introduction of glyphosate resistant technology, and then a steady increase that likely correlates to the emergence of glyphosate resistant weeds. And then this major spike. So if you click through, you see 2016 through 2017 on the left. It's very stark how the deep red in the map spreads. So the amount of dicamba applied to all US crops more than doubles in 2017 relative to 2016, driven by this increased use of dicamba resistant soybean and cotton. So did the new herbicide formulations though actually fix the problems with volatility? The short answer is no. These photos show some typical symptoms of dicamba exposure. The photo on the left shows soybeans with the distinctive leaf cupping from dicamba drift. In 2017, for example, an estimated 3.6 million acres of non-dicamba resistant soybeans were injured, and complaints to weed scientists and state departments of agriculture about suspected dicamba injury to trees, vegetables, specialty crops, ornamental plants, commercial nurseries also spiked. Kim is going to actually talk about in much more detail about symptoms and monitoring of these, so I will leave it at that for now. But one thing I did want to make very clear, however, is that while early season burn down of use of dicamba herbicides has always posed drift concerns, The level of injuries has been unprecedented since the adoption of the in-crop herbicides used later into the growing season, when temperatures are higher and there's greater risk of evaporating off plant and soil surfaces and moving off site. It's also widely recognized that these injuries are underreported. So there's probably a lot more injury going unreported that is not known. So what also means, unfortunately, is that dicamba resistant crops are a self-reinforcing technology. As soon as some growers in an area adopt the new technology, nearby soybean growers are pushed to also purchase and plant resistant seeds to avoid risk of off-target injury and yield losses. And then once they have the resistant technology seeds, they are more inclined to start using those herbicides that are marketed for use with those seeds. And as you can see, this might lead to rapid adoption of the trait. And also increased social tensions among farmers using and not using these drift-prone technologies. So as state pesticide regulatory agencies started being inundated with herbicide injury complaints, we saw mostly short-term fixes, such as new required trainings for dicamba applicators. Individual states implemented a patchwork of regulations, with some states putting in place May or June cutoff dates for dicamba applications and temperature cutoffs. The labels became even more complicated and onerous, with large downwind buffer requirements, sometimes up to 250 feet in many cases, limitations on the wind, speeds, temperature, and rainfall conditions under which dicamba could be sprayed, and complex requirements for spray nozzle settings and triple cleaning equipment after use. This slide shows just one page of a 9-page, very small, fine print dicamba label on the left here. So label restrictions become nearly impossible to follow, and in some states there were only a few hours in a few days when dicamba could be applied based on wind, temperature, and expected rainfall. These complicated labels have then placed the burden of dicamba drift injuries on farmers and applicators instead of on manufacturers. If injury occurs, the applicator is a convenient scapegoat for a chemical with a drift problem. So restrictions have clearly not fixed the issue and have actually in some cases made it worse. So for example, in Iowa in 2020 and in Arkansas in past years, a small window of opportunity for when you could spray dicamba based on label restrictions meant that a ton of dicamba was applied all at once across the state, and injury was simply wall to wall across like entire counties. Weed scientists pointed out that this is called atmospheric loading of dicamba because landscape level and caused landscape level drift injury. So much dicamba moved into the atmosphere at once that it became impossible to pinpoint any one source of injury. So what's happening now? Despite the evidence that these over-the-top dicamba herbicides had caused substantial widespread damage since their conditional approval, the EPA decided to extend the conditional registrations for the 3 over-the-top products for an additional 5 years in late 2020. However, there are yet more regulations as discussed earlier. Now EPA has established 2 federal cutoff dates for use of the 3 herbicides, June 30th for soybeans and July 30th for corn, with some other specific product-based restrictions as well. However, dicamba cutoff dates will continue to vary by state in 2021. 3 states have opted to create more restrictive dates, though that's a little bit in flux still, either by some state rulemaking or other state relevant laws. So for example, Arkansas is May 25th. In Illinois, it's June 20th. And I think Illinois also has an additional 85 degree temperature restriction. Indiana has a June 20th cutoff. And the new labels also include expanded buffers designed to limit off-target movement. The first required buffer is a 240 feet downwind buffer, and it is necessary for most every dicamba application. So dicamba-related pesticide complaints remain high in the last few years, and a coalition of non-governmental organizations filed a lawsuit citing EPA's flawed approval process. In June 2020, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals vacated the three 2018 conditional registrations of those three previous dicamba products, citing EPA's failure to acknowledge evidence of substantial and undisputed damage. With the recent EPA's 2020 registration decision, there are now a number of lawsuits that, and so it remains to be seen how they move through. At the same time, EPA is considering adding corn to the label of at least one in-crop dicamba product for use with dicamba-resistant corn. A manufacturer has also recently applied to register a 5 herbicide-tolerant corn trait, which would include dicamba and 2,4-D, in addition to others. So if these are all also approved, we would see mid-season dicamba use really expand to tens of millions of more crop acreage across the US. This would increase the drift risk for many millions of acres of wild plant communities and wildlife that depend on them. So with that optimistic look into the future, I'll turn it over to Emily, who will be going through more about the extensive dicamba use, what extensive dicamba use on and off-site means for wildlife.
Thanks, Leica. And I did want to just mention that the cutoff date of July 30th was for cotton, not for corn.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No worries. All right. So my name's Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And our work focuses on protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. So it's really been great working with NWF and Prairie Rivers on this issue. So as Leica just explained, due to the volatile nature of dicamba, it can move off-site even several days after it's been applied, meaning that even when an applicator applies the herbicide on a perfect day, according to the very complex set of label guidelines, injury to non-resistant to sensitive crops and plants, including wildlife habitat, can still occur. And these injuries are occurring well beyond the edges of fields and outside of those recommended buffer zones. So symptoms have been observed in schoolyards, in backyards, in both public and private lands, as well as in some high priority natural areas. And Kim's going to speak right after me to give a more detailed overview of what those symptoms look like. But I figured we should probably talk first about what herbicide drift might mean for wild plants and the wildlife that depend on them. So when we think about how pesticides are or could be harming insects and other wildlife, it's important to remember that many of these species and their ecosystems are already experiencing multiple stressors, including severe weather events like droughts and floods and fires, invasive species, diseases, pollution, and just general habitat loss across many landscapes. So many groups of flying insects, and then, within those groups, species of butterflies, bumblebees, and beetles are experiencing severe population declines already. So then we add in herbicides and herbicide drift, which can have both direct impacts on insects. So that's more like a lethal or a sublethal impact from direct exposure to the chemical. There have been lab studies that have shown that direct contact with dicamba can be harmful for adult lady beetles, which are an important beneficial insect for controlling soft-bodied insects like aphids. Feeding on dicamba contaminated plants can also be harmful to some insects. There have been studies showing that caterpillars feeding on host plants that were treated with drift level doses of dicamba experienced reduced biomass in those caterpillar phases. So that's sort of a direct impact from the herbicide. But there's also indirect impacts, which are probably quite a bit broader. And so we know very little about how the current rates of use are impacting wildlife and all of these wild plants that they're depending on. So the largest risk of dicamba use to bees and other beneficial insects is likely to be that indirect impact, as herbicide injury leads to a loss of food sources and declines in forage quality. So studies have shown that drift rates of dicamba can reduce the diversity of forage plants available for pollinators and other insects, as well as the quality of that forage. So how much pollen and nectar is it producing? As well as the number of flowers that are produced by a plant. Flowers exposed to dicamba may delay flowering or produce fewer flowers. And so that's also going to lead to lower seed production, which has impacts on other wildlife as well. We also know from some studies that flowers exposed to dicamba drift are generally visited less frequently by pollinators. So these impacts on forage could ripple through numerous food webs, including those of birds, which rely on a wide variety of plants and invertebrates for food resources. So one of the big unknowns, we have a lot of unknowns with dicamba, is the potential for repeated drift events over time. So both within a season as well as over multiple years. If a plant or plant community is being exposed multiple times to these drift level doses, what's that mean for plant health and vigor? And then long-term, what are the population level impacts of those repeated drift events? So the concern, of course, is that plant death or this reduced and delayed flowering from drift events could potentially lead to bigger losses of function in plant pollinator networks, as well as in the food webs that depend on them. These broader ecological consequences of really widespread injury from dicamba and other plant growth regulator herbicides are unknown. There are critical relationships that exist between many native plants and animals. Many native trees and herbaceous plants host thousands of species of insects. Groups of trees like oaks and willows, birches, poplars, cottonwoods, and maples each host individually as genera over 300 species of moths and butterflies, many of which serve not only as pollinators, but also as critical sources of food for birds and mammals. 9 out of 10 birds eat insects at some point during their life cycles. In addition, these low-level doses of dicamba might make plants more susceptible to diseases and pests. We all know that when we're personally stressed out, we're more susceptible to getting a cold or getting some kind of illness. It's much the same for plants. If a plant is weakened or stressed out by a drift level dose of dicamba, other stressors like insect pests or diseases, flooding and droughts might have a compounding negative effect on their health. So all of the wildlife you see here also rely on seeds, fruits, nuts, cones, bark, and flesh of trees and other plants for food. And these plants are providing nesting habitat and shelter as well. So there's lots of potential impacts to consider and broader ecological consequences of landscape scale drift impacts. In addition to those terrestrial wildlife impacts, there are potential impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Dicamba and other herbicides like 2,4-D are water soluble, and they can easily enter surface water bodies where they might pose risks to aquatic life. So we talked again about direct and indirect impacts, but in terms of direct impacts, amphibians are particularly susceptible to environmental contaminants. They have permeable skin, which allows for rapid exposure and uptake of environmental contaminants. And both dicamba and glyphosate have been shown to directly impact tadpole development in the Argentine common toad, which is the same genus as many common toads in the US, raising concerns about potential impacts on similar toad species in North America from dicamba. So the contamination of water bodies and surface water has the potential to affect not only aquatic species such as fish, aquatic inverts, and amphibians, but also all of the animals that rely on aquatic systems for food and water, like migratory birds and mammals. So I think I'm just going to end with talking about knowledge gaps, because there's significant knowledge gaps remain on the environmental as well as the human health impacts of widespread use of dicamba. The human health part is much beyond the scope of what we can touch on today, but in terms of the potential for wildlife impacts, there's a lot left to understand about the patterns of impacts across landscapes. How much herbicide is volatilizing into the atmosphere? Where and how far are these herbicides traveling, and at what rates are they landing on unintended plants? When they do land and they fall out onto unintended plants, what are the short and long-term impacts of those doses of dicamba to herbaceous and woody plants? How are nectar and pollen, seed and nut and fruit production affected by herbicide drift, including from these repeated exposures in 1 year and over multiple years? And then how are invertebrates, birds, and other wildlife responding to those changes in habitat and food, both in aquatic systems and terrestrial systems? Are we seeing changes over time? So we have a lot of information compiled on potential wildlife impacts and knowledge gaps in our report. So I would suggest you take a look if you want to learn more. But clearly there's a great need for a better understanding of how and where herbicide drift is impacting native plant communities. And so learning to recognize and helping to monitor and report symptoms of herbicide injury is what Kim is going to talk about next. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Thanks, Emily. Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Ernst-Pitcher, and I'm the Habitat and Agriculture Program Specialist at Prairie Rivers Network. We're a statewide conservation organization in Illinois. As you've just heard, landowners and land managers in many states have reported injuries in crops, trees, and plants that are symptomatic of exposure to dicamba or other growth regulator herbicides. To our knowledge, there are no comprehensive ecological monitoring programs examining the prevalence of these herbicides in the environment, the impacts they have on trees, plants, and wildlife. So this portion of the talk is not about diagnosing something as herbicide injury. It's about building awareness and helping people recognize how to document the presence and the absence of symptoms of possible growth regulator herbicide in plants and trees. It's meant to underscore that documentation is important, and reporting and monitoring provides valuable information that can lead to a better understanding of this problem. Now, I'm not a weed scientist. My background is in ecology, similar to Emily, but this has been such an enormous issue in Illinois that many of us have learned way more about symptoms of herbicide injury and plant health than we ever thought we would. Many of the photos that you will see today are from submissions to Prairie Rivers Network's Tree and Plant Health Monitoring Program, which was designed to document symptoms of potential herbicide growth, potential herbicide exposure in trees and plants. We have a limited amount of time today to discuss a really complex topic. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes covering how to recognize a few of the most important symptoms in crops, trees, and plants. And I'll also mention some important things to keep in mind when you're monitoring or thinking of designing a monitoring program. I'll also touch on some ways of how you can report symptoms. It's widely recognized that the intensity of symptoms and the potential for yield or plant loss can depend on many factors. These include the herbicide or herbicides being used, the level of exposure or the number of exposures, the crop or plant sensitivity to that herbicide, the growth stage of the plant, overall plant health, as well as numerous environmental conditions. Common symptoms may include leaf cupping, curling, twisting, or puckering. Also, stunted leaves are fairly common, as well as strapping or a narrowing and elongation of the leaf, as well as discolored foliage, most typically chlorosis or a yellowing is the most common discoloration that you'll see. Damage from weather, insects, and diseases can be confused with herbicide damage. If you're unsure about what you're seeing, it's always a good idea to document symptoms, take a bunch of photographs, and reach out to a local expert that may be able to help you. Before we start talking about symptoms, let's talk about a few things that is good to pay attention to before you report and monitor. If you're looking at a yard or you're in a park and you notice symptoms, look at the ground around you. Has the turf or lawn been treated for weeds? And many lawn care products contain herbicides like Dicamba or 2,4-D, and these target broadleaf plants such as clover, plantain, chickweed, etc. These chemicals can drift during application, they can volatilize after application, and they can also be absorbed by the roots of nearby trees. If the area you're seeing symptoms in has a perfect lush bed of grass, then there is the possibility that that could be the source of injury. So investigate it first. If it's your lawn and you did it yourself, then you don't want to report it, but you do want to document those symptoms for your own information and make sure that you don't harm your trees accidentally again in the future. When you document symptoms, it's important to take really, really good notes. Writing down the date and note if it's early or mid or late growing season in your area. It's recommended to make observations more than once a year. Describe the location, like what portion of the property are you on? Record the weather, the plants that are affected, and the plants that seem unaffected, the symptoms that you're observing, and any other information that you think might help you remember what you observed when you go back to look at it later on. Take photos of different plant types, several different species that are showing symptoms, as well as photos that are up close and of the whole plant. It's also important to check for symptoms on more than one plant type, and I'll say this a couple times in the presentation. If you suspect injury from dicamba or another growth regulator herbicide, you should see symptoms on a variety of broadleaf plants. They may not all have the same severity of symptoms, and there may be a gradient in that severity, but this will help rule out other causes. This is recommended whether you're looking at a crop, a garden, landscaping, trees, natural areas, etc. Examining the condition of surrounding plants will help you rule out some other factors such as disease or insects. And it doesn't hurt to take a close look at the leaves to examine for insects. Also, keep in mind that not all plants react the same way. When in doubt, ask an expert. So let's start off looking at some symptoms in crops. I've made these photos really large so that you can see what the leaves look like. On the left is a photo of a peach tree that has pretty severe curling and deformation. In this instance, thousands of trees had damage. The severity of the symptoms varied throughout the orchard's fields, but they were present throughout. On the right is a photo of an apple tree showing typical symptoms. You'll notice the curling in the leaves. These are soybeans. There has been a lot of attention paid to soybean injury from dicamba, but other crops, trees, and plants, as you've heard, have also been injured. This shows the classic curling and cupping, which is probably the most common symptoms observed. And here we have green beans. As you can see, the leaves are cupping, they're curling, and they're generally deformed. Here we have a tomato plant. The most apparent symptom is curling. There's also a twisting of the leaves and of the stem. And here's another example of symptoms in tomato. Here you can really see the curling and the twisting. Now let's look at some symptomatic trees. This is not a soybean plant. It's what I thought when I first saw it. It's a photo of the leaves of a northern Catalpa tree. This tree has several symptoms going on. Notice the puckering, the cupping, and the curling in the leaves. And if you look at the hand holding the leaf, you'll also note that these leaves are stunted. If you're familiar with northern catalpas, typically they have very large leaves. And from this photo, in my opinion, it looks like there may be a little bit of chlorosis or yellowing in the leaves. I'll emphasize it again, whether you're looking at a field of a single crop or a vegetable garden or a pasture or prairie or woodland, it's always recommended that if you think you see something that is symptomatic of herbicide injury on a plant or a group of plants, examine the other areas nearby that have trees and plants. Again, if multiple species and plant types over a large area have similar symptoms, that increases the likelihood that what you're observing are symptoms of herbicide drift. In our experience monitoring, sweet gums appear to be a little less sensitive to growth regulator than other species such as oaks. This sweet gum is showing moderate cupping and drooping. The next 3 slides highlight some variation that you might expect to see in trees. As I said before, cupping and curling are probably the most commonly reported symptoms, but that cupping and curling, like many of the other symptoms, can vary in severity between species, within species, and between locations, or even at the same location. This redbud has noticeably curled, cupped leaves, and the leaves are cupping up. Some of the leaves are also starting to show scalloping or irregular edges. Here's another example of redbud. These are cupping down, and they also have irregular margins or edges. And another example of redbud. These symptoms are not as pronounced as in the previous photos, but you can see some cupping and even some general folding starting to occur. And it's worth noting that symptoms in trees will typically hang on to injuries or symptoms of those injuries throughout the growing season. Whereas in herbaceous plants, we see that there's a tendency to grow out of the injury or it becomes noticeably less severe later on in the growing season. This is an example of cupping in oak. This is black oak. Oaks appear to be especially affected, and they're an important species in many hardwood forests. They're often a dominant species. They are a keystone species in our central hardwood forests, and they provide important food for wildlife, and as Emily mentioned, are important host plants for many moth and butterfly species. They're also very important economically as well. So the next several photos, I'll show symptoms in a variety of oak species. This is white oak. These leaves are stunted and deformed. It's hard to tell, but this is a red oak. It is a fairly severe example of symptoms in red oak, where the leaves are curled in on themselves and they appear to be stunted and deformed. Here's another example of stunted and deformed leaves in red oak. This is a swamp white oak. It has cupping and it is a good example of leaves showing irregular margins. This is bur oak. You'll notice that the leaves appear to be stretched out or elongated. The technical term for that is strapping. And this is what I would consider to be a mild to moderate example of strapping. Here we have Pignut Hickory. The leaves are obviously curled, twisted, and deformed. Now, sycamores are another tree that we're paying attention to. While they can be prone to anthracnose, which is a fungal disease in the spring, they tend to be sensitive to growth regulator herbicides in mid-season. And here is a sycamore with some obvious downward cupping and curling. This is another example of symptoms in sycamore. This one has more pronounced cupping. It's almost bowl-shaped. and yet another example of sycamore. Now these leaves are drooping and kind of folding in. The injury is kind of varied on this tree. Some are almost tent-like. This is flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. Dogwoods commonly show symptoms of curling in irregular margins or edges. This is a fairly light example of symptoms. Believe it or not, this is also flowering dogwood. Notice the scalloping or irregular margins and cupping in the leaves. And this is sugar maple, showing some cupping and curling. If you look at the photo on the left, you'll see that the branch is being held up in order for the photo to be taken, but you can still notice that these leaves are drooping a little bit. And you'll also see some chlorosis or yellowing around the edges in these leaves. The photo on the right is also sugar maple, similar, although the symptoms in this tree are slightly more severe. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to observe what is happening in larger trees. One additional thing that you may want to notice is canopy thinning. There just isn't the shade that used to be there, and you can see more light through the trees than you could in the past. This is where having binoculars or a camera with a telephoto lens can really help. From a distance, many trees may look normal, but you really do have to walk up to them or find a way to get a better look. And once you've seen symptoms in a number of species, it becomes easier to spot. You train your eyes to recognize the healthy versus the unhealthy trees and plants. And this is white oak. It has noticeably stunted leaves that are severely curled. You'll notice the larger leaves in this photo as well. Those appear to be sort of a last-ditch effort for this tree to form leaves that can do the work it needs to have done for the year. In the next few slides, we're going to get into some prairie plants or native forbs. And this is rosin weed, Silphium integrifolium. On the left is an example of a normal plant. It's not showing any real symptoms of herbicide exposure at all. On the right is a very different looking plant. You'll notice the twisting and the curling of these leaves. This is compass plant, another one of the silphiums. From our observations, silphiums tend to be fairly sensitive to growth regulator herbicides. You'll notice the curling and the twisting in the leaves of this plant. And here's a final example of symptoms in compass plant. Here you can see the twisting and curling in the leaves up close. And finally, this is sweet coneflower, Rudbeckia Subtomatosa. You'll notice that the leaves on this plant have curled and cupped leaves, something that you might see, or similar to what you might see on a soybean plant or a green bean. So I realized that was a lot of information and we really only scratched the surface. However, there are numerous technical manuals out there that offer other examples of herbicide injury, as well as more detailed information that we aren't able to get into today. Here, there's two examples of resources that you may find helpful. Diseases in Trees in the Great Plains, or Diseases of Trees in the Great Plains, has a couple of really good sections that discuss herbicide injury. And additionally, this booklet from Purdue Extension on diagnosing herbicide injury on garden and landscape plants is another good resource. There are numerous other publications out there that can help you learn about symptoms. So the next several slides focus on ways that you can report symptoms. Many states use reporting information to help evaluate the efficacy of their pesticide regulations. So reporting information has a real value, and reporting symptoms has a real value, especially now given the current status of pesticide-related injuries across the landscape. Since we have folks on this call from around the US talking about specifics of where you can report, gets tricky. The US EPA has links on their website to resources of where you can report suspected pesticide instances. If you happen to notice symptoms on public lands, it's best to contact that agency that is responsible for its management and bring it to their attention. On the US EPA's website, you'll notice a link to the National Pesticide Information Center. Their Ecological Incident Reporting Portal collects information from government organizations, public, academia, wildlife rehab centers, conservation groups, beekeepers, etc. And they deliver information to EPA on those incidences. They do not, however, collect information for enforcement. Now, each state, as I mentioned, has a different process, and each state also has one agency that is tasked with working cooperatively with US EPA to enforce federal pesticide regulations and respond to potential incidences or complaints. The pesticide regulations on tribal lands may be enforced by a tribal designee, but they also may be enforced by the US EPA. And if you don't know what agency is responsible for regulating pesticides in your state, there's several ways that you can find out. This is the National Pesticide Information Center's website. This map of the US has links to each state's regulatory office. This does not take you directly to the misuse or incidents reporting process for each state. So you'll need to do a little bit of digging and call the agency or explore their website to find out exactly who you need to speak to and where you need to turn in your report. So let's talk briefly about what you might expect if you file a report with your state agency. You'll need to fill out a form for your state, which provides details about the suspected injuries to your property, detailing the symptoms. Photos are very helpful, even if they don't require them. I recommend sending photos along. They often ask if you know of a violation or a misuse. If you don't know, that's okay. You don't have to say so. They may send a field officer out to examine reported injuries, and they may also take a sample for analysis. So at the end of all this, you should expect a letter in a couple of months, depending on how backlogged they are, detailing the findings of their investigation. So there are some efforts underway to monitor and understand the issue of herbicide drift and its impacts to natural areas and trees and wildlife habitat. Some of these efforts are being led by agencies responsible for natural resource management, and others are being led by nonprofits. The only efforts that I'm aware of that involve the general public or volunteers are run by the Nebraska Forest Service, Audubon, Arkansas, and Prairie Rivers Network in Illinois. And as Emily said, really large knowledge gaps still exist, and there is much to learn. Again, this is a quick overview. Feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions or take a look at our report. If I can't answer your questions, I'll do my best to direct you to someone who can. Now I'll turn it over to Leica to wrap things up for us today. Thanks, Leica.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Emily. To make sure we have enough time for and can get to your questions, do put in any of your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. I'm seeing one come through already. But just to wrap things up, and again, like we've said before, there's much more information in our report, but where we outline, for example, a more sustainable vision of what we're asking for. Because herbicide-only weed control is not a resilient system, and overuse of herbicides inevitably leads to the breakdown of these systems and with the development of resistant weeds. So what we are asking for is a move towards multi-tactic strategies that incorporate cultural, mechanical, and biological weed management techniques to reduce weed seed production and growth, but that can also help farmers achieve more effective and sustainable weed management. Our report outlines what we mean by ecological weed management, but just to quickly summarize, their practices that include choosing crop varieties that are competitive with weeds, adjusting planting dates and depths of crops to help get ahead of weed growth, managing nutrients in ways that give crops a competitive edge, and other mechanical strategies, but basically adopting multiple strategies for weed control to minimize the need for herbicide applications. So to achieve some of this vision, we also outline some steps in our report, starting with the need to remedy the underinvestment in public domain research on weed management, which has hindered the adoption of more complex but sustainable weed management systems. Also, we recognize that changing behavior is rarely easy, particularly when social norms, as well as the ease and affordability of the current system, don't support such changes. So acknowledging and incorporating local knowledge and decision-making stressors into the design of these systems, along, of course, with technical assistance through extension services and other avenues for growers can hopefully contribute to long-term shifts in behavior around weed management. So looking ahead, 2020 was a high drift damage year. And now we have the 3 dicamba herbicides that have been registered for a further 5 years. Even with certain changes to cutoff dates and a requirement for mixing the herbicides before application with additives that will increase the pH to try to reduce volatility, we don't really, and additional buffer requirements that I mentioned earlier, we don't really know whether this will reduce the amount of drift we see from dicamba in 2021. We aren't feeling very hopeful, but we'll see. Which is why it's really important to get eyes on the ground and monitor and document symptoms across the landscape and see what happens this year. What we see this year in terms of total drift impact may affect ongoing litigation around these herbicides. Additionally, we're seeing reports of supply chain issues around herbicides related to the ongoing pandemic. So it remains to be seen how that impacts what gets put out there this year. So looking ahead, as we're seeing dicamba resistant weeds emerge, for example, dicamba resistant pigweed has been documented in certain states. We are expecting the weed resistance cycle to continue, to keep going, and for companies to turn to additional stacked herbicide traits in their seed products. So if it's not dicamba, it might be something else. I mentioned this earlier, but dicamba use in corn it continues to be allowed. So we are going to start seeing large landscape scale application multiple times a year. This new application by a manufacturer for a new corn trait that is resistant to 5 herbicides, for example, will include dicamba and 2,4-D. And related to that, the USDA's APHIS Animal Plant Health wing is requesting public comments to help identify alternatives and relevant information and studies as they're considering the environment impact statement for that new 5 herbicide resistant corn trait. So that could be an opportunity to put in comments, and that deadline is coming up on May 28th. So with that, we can end. We have our contact information here.